Very good. Now, welcome everyone. This is our penultimate Lichtenstein lecture, made possible by the generosity of Dorothy Lichtenstein. I'm Helen Harrison, director of the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center, and I'm delighted to introduce Greta Berman's talk, The Humanity of Harold Lehman, in conjunction with our current exhibition, Harold Lehman, the 1930s. Now, Greta's out of the country, so her talk has been pre-recorded. That means you won't be able to ask her questions, but if you have any, please put them in the chat and I'll try to answer on her behalf. Now, she did ask me to point out a typo in her slides. Lehman's Rikers Island mural was painted in 1937 to 38, not 1935, as you'll see on the screen. Greta Berman, a professor of art history at the Julliard School, is an authority on the New Deal art projects. Her doctoral dissertation, The Lost Years, Mural Painting in New York City under the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project, 1935 to 1943, was published by Garland Press in 1978. In addition to writing a monthly column, Focus on Art, for the Julliard Journal, Greta co-organized the 2008 exhibition, Synesthesia, Art and the Mind, at the McMaster Museum of Art in Hamilton, Ontario, and she co-edited its catalog. She has published numerous articles as well as lectured on New Deal art, synesthesia, and other subjects. Now I'm going to share my screen and present her talk.
Hello, my name is Greta Berman. I wish I could be there in person, but unfortunately, it's not possible right now. I also haven't yet seen the exhibition, which I'd like to see. However, I do know a bit about WPA murals, and Helen Harrison has asked me to give a talk about Harold Lehman in the context of WPA murals. I'm going to assume that a lot of you know about the WPA. Very briefly, it was, of course, a project under Franklin Roosevelt for work, and it included artists as a very important part. The mural project was by no means the only project of the WPA. However, it was the most visible one. So Harold Lehman was born in New York City in 1913, but he spent the years from 1919 to 35 in Los Angeles, where he met Philip Guston, Reuben Kadish, Jackson Pollock, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. In 1935, Lehman moved to New York City, where he helped Siqueiros organize his experimental workshop, and along with Guston and Kadish, was hired by the WPA FAP, that is the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project, to paint murals. This was a prestigious thing for a young man. And his murals, like so many others at the time, dealt primarily with human beings and issues that had to do with poverty, capitalism, incarceration. And his most famous, I would say deservedly so, mural was titled Man's Daily Bread. And it was for the penitentiary at Rikers Island. Unfortunately, it no longer exists, but we can see some excellent photographs and studies for it here. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we'll start out by looking at some of his works. I've called this talk The Humanity of Harold Lehman, and these were his dates. And I'd like to start out with the work here entitled Man's Daily Bread. It is, as I said, unfortunately not in existence anymore. And the fortunate thing is that we do have these quite wonderful photographs of it. You can say that his style at the time is what most of us think of as WPA. It's also interesting that several others, off the top of my head, I can think of Philip Guston, James Brooks, Seymour Fogel. Like these others, he went on later to semi-abstract, abstract, and even surrealist styles. It's clear that his experience painting murals during the 30s informed his life work. But for now and here, our emphasis is on Lehman's work during the 30s. This huge mural, Man's Daily Bread, was 20 feet high by 70 feet long, and it was placed in the cafeteria of Rikers Island Penitentiary in New York City. You can see here, if you look at it carefully, a sort of central panel with people gathered around a table and literally bread in the middle. And then workers on either side doing the work that was required in order to make the bread, chopping down trees, tilling the fields. And you can see corn in the background. You can see various incidents, somebody even drilling over there. Lehman said about this, I came up with the theme Man's Daily Bread because the mural was in the mess hall of Rikers Island Prison, where 800 to 900 prisoners ate 3 times a day. So it seemed to me that a theme that had some connection with not only the handling of food, but the idea of earning one's bread by one's own sweat, so to speak, would have some good constructive connection with that prison without being an obvious lecture. This kind of thinking was quite in line with other WPA murals that dealt with the history and meaning of a place. And I'm going to show you another one that also, unfortunately, was destroyed, that was done for a women's penitentiary in 1938 by Lucien Bloch, who happens to have been the daughter of the composer Ernest Bloch. The idea here, again, was to make everyday activities that related to what people who were incarcerated would see and would think about. This mural, we know, had a big impact on prisoners. Women actually adopted, quote unquote, some of these children, gave them names, got involved in it. And interestingly, Ben Shawn, who had originally been hired for the Rikers mural, had his proposal rejected because it dealt with prison reform and included sketches of prisoners in various states of torture, chain gangs, police lineups. The authorities preferred Lehman's more positive message. So this one that you see here, as I said, also for a penitentiary, has a positive message. Everybody, all women, had something to do with children. And we see this very cheerful kind of mural here. All of the murals in the 1930s had to be influenced by Diego Rivera. Even Thomas Hart Benton, putatively Rivera's enemy. Let's look at the Rivera mural. You probably know about the history of this. Rivera had started painting it in 1933-34. It was a fresco. And according to history, Rockefeller was furious that he included Lenin here in the mural. And shortly after it was started, had it destroyed. I actually met people who found pieces of that mural. It had to be cut out of, chiseled out of the wall because it was a true fresco. It was originally slated to be in the large lobby of 30 Rock Center, main building. and it was originally called The Man at the Crossroads, but Rivera redid it years later, or actually very shortly afterwards. And we have this wonderful photograph of the mural that is in Mexico City at the Museum de Bellas Artes. You see here something that you're going to see in many WPA murals, a sort of central figure, a large wheel or axis, things are moving, people on one side, people on another side, compartmentalized. It happens in this particular one that on the right-hand side are the good people, the socialists, the communists. On this side are the bad people, the soldiers, the policemen hitting people with clubs, and the upper class who are eating and drinking over here. Here you do see some people learning, you see science and progress, and at the bottom, typical of Rivera, agriculture. Thomas Hart Benton did a history of Indiana in about 1930, 1933. And you can see a similar kind of idea. As I said, it's done about the same time. It's not WPA. Benton was never on the WPA. But the idea of the compartmentalized, of fragments of things that come together in a way that shows progress, shows people, all kinds of different things. I was privileged to see this at the University of Indiana a couple of months ago. Another mural that relates to the mural that Lehman did is a mural by James Brooks entitled Flight. And this one has a theme that, again, related to people. They could go to the airport at that time, and even now it's called the Marine Air Terminal. At that time, it was the major hub for international air travel. And they would see a huge mural all the way around the walls of a history of flight. Here's a detail of a couple of the figures, a man and a woman who are making flight patterns and so on. It's interesting because the problem that Brooks had, and this mural was not destroyed, but it was painted over sometime during the 1950s, and it has since been restored. His problem was not so much the idea that it could be leftist, although that might have been part of it, but he was really a modernist. James Brooks used this as a way to kind of experiment with shapes and colors and forms, something that he later developed and became an abstract expressionist. Here's another scene from Flight, where a group of people are sitting around and seeing Icarus, who flies too close to the sun and falls down. And here another view. Sorry, it's not as good a slide, but Leonardo da Vinci, alias, or AKA, one of the Wright brothers, who kind of invented flight, and all of these beautiful kind of patterns around. So another interesting story is the story of the Harlem Hospital murals. This is what it looked like in 2012 at the outside of the hospital. What Harlem Hospital did is they took the murals that had been in another building, and they were restored several times. It's a long story. But eventually they took them off the walls and put them inside this building that's now known as the Mural Pavilion. Here you see two of the murals that were inside the nurses' residence by Charles Alston. And this kind of relates to what Lehman did in a lot of his murals, the idea of having something that people could look at and relate to what they did. So here is a hospital, and in the hospital, we see what Alston described as people, Black and white, working together with the objectivity of science. And on the other side was the idea of primitive, so-called medicine, which had idols and animals sacrificed. This is a detail of magic in medicine, where we see a large kind of symbolic figure, animals that later would be used for Sira, what he referred to as a conjure woman, and somebody sick who is being treated through magic. And on the other side, we had a gigantic microscope, and the Greek father of medicine, and doctors and nurses. One little interesting sideline is that this nurse was actually not a nurse, but she was Alston's wife, who at the time was a surgeon. But he said, who would believe that a Black woman could be a surgeon? So instead, he depicted her as a nurse. Here is the group of murals that went along the hallways outside the nurse's residence. The major artist was named Vertus Hayes, and the work was called Pursuit of Happiness. And in the Pursuit of Happiness, we see the history of people of color going from African villages through to, I don't know if we have a better detail of it, but they're in the South and picking cotton. Here at the end, they're facing a turning point, again, this gigantic cogwheel going from the countryside, the South, into the North and into New York City, where they take up trades, become doctors, nurses, artists, and of course, involved in the church and singing and music. This is a detail of that large mural that is kind of the turning point, where this actually is a wheel and a kind of barrow that comes from their toiling in the fields to the family looking now towards this gigantic wheel of progress and of coming into the city. And this is a mural that we saw a little bit in the larger group there of a Black person giving a sermon, the chorus, the organ, and here what some people have speculated might be Cab Calloway and the Cotton Club. Well, this mural, and here's another detail of the religious one. These looked originally, when I found them, somewhat like this. This is a rather small mural by a very young woman. She was only 17 or 18 at the time that she painted this, called Recreation in Harlem. And here you can see people involved with swimming, singing, and sewing and things that they could do. Here it is after restoration. Unfortunately, through the restoration, they lost some of the colors in the original one, but here you can see what it looks like. And here's a collage that Harlem Hospital put together showing some of the various parts of the mural that you just saw. Well, this mural has a very interesting history to it. The white superintendent of hospitals at the time that it was painted did not like the idea of having Black people on the walls of his hospital. He said, well, who knows, years from now, it might not even be in a Black neighborhood. There might be white people. And he tried to get this removed, but fortunately, a lot of people came to the support of the muralists, and it remained in place to be, of course, left to deteriorate years later, and then restored and now celebrated. Another success story is one by Edward Lanning called The Story of the Recorded Word, that was done 1938 to 42. This one you can visit in the 42nd Street Library, the New York Public Library, and you can see the various ideas having to do with writing and, of course, reading. It's a library, so it's the history of the printed word. He starts out with and the linotype Mergenthaler and Whitelaw read here. So these showed something that people in the library could look at and relate to. Of course, they could relate to a young boy reading, and on the other side, a mother and son both reading. The artists were so inspired that when Lanning painted the ceiling, he painted Prometheus stealing the fire from the gods. And so many of the mural painters felt that they wanted to equal Renaissance and Baroque painting. Lucien Bloch did another mural in true fresco called The History of Music, which she did for George Washington High School in 1938. And at the time, and I wanted to get this for you, she searched for a visual corollary to music and concluded that the only way other than instruments to depict music was through sound waves. And so she organized the mural around an oscillating pattern of lines. The rich earth tones of her panels represent African, Asian, European, and American musical forms, and art with a melange of instruments. Wedged between Balinese cymbals and a medieval harp stands the modern chorus, a positive affirmation of ethnic diversity and racial harmony. This building now houses several smaller schools, and I believe this mural still exists. However, at the time she did it, the principal decided he didn't like it for whatever the reason. He had the whole mural covered over, or actually, I think torn out because it was, or chipped out because it was a true fresco. And she and some assistants got permission. People protested, and she repainted the whole thing the following year. So why was the principal upset about it? It could have been the chorus here that shows people of the kind of diversity and inclusion we like to think that we are celebrating today. At the time, when you did something like this, it would automatically be called communist. Or the other reason could be the sort of semi-abstract forms that she has in it. She uses these to show a kind of almost semi-cubistic and interesting sort of progress. She knew music. Her father, as I said, was the famous composer Ernest Bloch. Another mural, The Story of Richmond Hill, was done in 1936 by Philip Evergood. This, I believe, still exists in the Richmond Hill Library in Queens. And here he did something that had to do with the history of the place. He shows people on one side in the city in soot and dirt and things that are not very pleasant, and a kind of brick wall separating out with the planners planning a new, beautiful, more rural community with people dancing around in a circle, and you have a very pleasant kind of scene instead of this scene here where we see subways and we see somebody over here wiping a tear out of his eye. You can tell where it is, 14th Street, Crosstown, and everything sort of gritty and dirty. So I wanted to go back to the other one. Apparently this woman represents one of the board of trustees, maybe the head, and she's a little bit reluctant to join in the dance. So again, this one was criticized. So many were, people felt they had the right to criticize because it was taxpayers' money. And one minister complained about the emphasis on mammary glands. Others just didn't like the idea that the figures are practically nude underneath their clothes. But it goes back to Evergood wanting to have a Renaissance sort of feel, an importance, a monumentality to his work. Not all of the murals were representational. Stuart Davis was an abstract painter who became more abstract, as so many did afterwards. But he created several murals under the patronage or sponsorship of Burgoyne Diller, who was the head of the mural division and an abstract painter himself. So Stuart Davis painted this mural for radio station WNYC. And this still exists. It's on a permanent loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is another mural that I recently had the privilege of seeing, and I'll show you the title and so on. It's called Swing Landscape, done between 1937 and 38. It fortunately was done in oil on canvas rather than fresco, so it could be preserved better. It's a very large mural, 86 by 173. And it was allocated by the government, the federal government, through the New Deal, to Indiana University, where it now resides in the Eskenazi Museum of Art. It is a spectacular mural, and it was never installed in this housing project that Burgoyne Diller persuaded the authorities to allow to have abstract murals. Why was it never installed? I think it's because it's so vibrant. There was no way that this was going to disappear into the architecture and become part of the wall. In fact, the critic for the New York Times at the time, Edward Alden Jewell, said about it that if it were spread on the floor or on outside as a signboard to Mars, people from Mars would be able to see it. And he said it really needed a whole housing project to itself, not just a wall. So back to Diego Rivera, who kind of started the whole thing. And we see the influences that he had on Lehman. And I'd like to talk now a little bit more about Lehman and his work and what he said. He said about the New Deal, well, first of all, he said that with the onset of World War II, a lot of the works were auctioned off, sold by the pound and not by the artwork. And there was no thought to preserving the murals and the art commission during the New Deal. So many works were destroyed, lost, or vandalized. And he thinks his work was destroyed sometime around 1962. Apparently, the warden at Rikers Island ordered it to be pulled down. And there's an account by Lehman. He says, nobody was told, nobody was given an opportunity to salvage it or to do anything about it to save it. The way I found out about it was quite by accident. I merely wanted to see the state of preservation of my painting. In 1975, I made a trip to Rikers Island and found, lo and behold, an empty wall. This is the only way that I found that my painting no longer existed. I had to go out there and discover this. Another mural that I think influenced Lehman was a mural by his friend, Philip Guston. And this one was done for the Queensbridge housing project, also during the 1930s. However, it fell into disrepair and was restored, and Guston himself said this was not, he refused to acknowledge that it was his work. Because he didn't like the restoration, it didn't really show the way he worked, he said. However, I think it does at least give a sense of Guston, of WPA murals, of very much what Lehman and others did at the time. So in fact, he has over here on the left, the whole thing is called work and play. So we have people, a family, we have people working, we have children play fighting. He has other paintings of that sort. There where they use ash can lids as shields and sticks as guns. There are dogs, there's cranes. Here, people playing basketball. Here, people playing musical instruments. And here, families together getting checkups and all kinds of positive things. This one where he shows people at a table reminds me very much of Lehman's Daily Bread. Here's a detail of the painting Man's Daily Bread, which is in the present show. And it's kind of similar to what Ben Shahn did in a post office mural in the Bronx. Here's Shahn's driller. The driller sort of becomes a symbol for the American worker, very powerful and doing something useful. But I noticed this is 1938 and this is 1937. So I'm wondering whether Lehman influenced Shahn, or whether, I don't really know much about the relationship. There are people who know more than I do about that, but there's certainly a similar feel to it. So there is one mural that still exists at Rikers Island, and that one was done by Anton Refregier, who also was a left-wing artist. And again, it has to do with home and family, things that would be positive to prisoners. Somebody, I found this online, put together what they called puzzle pieces. So these are pieces of the mural that he had there. And again, there are people at a table eating. There are people working. It has this sort of patchwork quilt that we've become familiar with. I'm going to go back to Lehman's major mural, the one that has been destroyed, called Man's Daily Bread, and let you look at it for a few minutes while I discuss some of the things that Lehman said. He made a personal statement about art and the New Deal which I find very strong. He said, the New Deal art projects were a phenomenon in our time. Although they are now history, every impartial observer recognizes their supreme importance for the development of American art. For myself, I can say they provided the opportunity to fulfill three main goals: to develop certain skills, to paint large-scale murals, and to reach an audience. That word audience is the clue. It was nationwide. For the first time, the arts reached into all the population centers. People who formerly had little or no contact with serious art, high art, if you will, were now made aware of all of them. It was an exhilarating experience for both artist and audience. We see the results even today in the enormous activity taking place in the arts all over the country, activity which would be inconceivable without the support given by the government in the 1930s and 40s through the federal art projects. In retrospect, the difficulties of the time, the occasional harassments from hostile critics, from congressmen who were always trying to abolish the projects, the layoffs, etc., fade away, and the essential values come to the fore, namely artists, formerly ignored by the government, or formerly ignored by the government, achieved a place in society they never could have done otherwise, due to active government support for the arts. Lehman wrote this in 1985. He was certainly not alone in his thoughts here. This was typical of many of the artists whom I have interviewed who were on the WPA, who were employed by it. It's been my pleasure to share my screen and to talk to you a little bit about the WPA murals. I'm very close to them because they were my doctoral dissertation. At the time I did them, I would ask people if the murals were there in some school, some hospital, and so on. And people would say, what mural? And I would say, are you sitting in room 366? And they would say, yes. And I'd say, would you please look over your shoulder at the wall? And do you see a painting there? Oh, that, they would say. And it was typical that so many of these works just were ignored. And as I said, with the James Brooks, with the Harlem Hospital, with Lucien Bloch, and of course with Harold Lehman, so many of them were painted over. It's just a wonderful thing that we have records of them. This time is now, once again, certainly relevant to what's happening today and much more celebrated than it ever was. I called my talk The Humanity of Harold Lehman. And as I looked at the checklist of the works in the exhibition, that's what came to the fore for me over and over again. His concern with people, with what made life worth living, even for people in a penitentiary. Thank you for your attention and enjoy the exhibition.
Well, that was really terrific. I think it's so interesting to put these things in context where these things were not done in a vacuum, and many of the artists, of course, knew one another and were interacting. Philip Guston, Reuben Kadish, Harold Lehman, and Jackson Pollock all knew one another in California and carried on that relationship into their work in New York City. And we're fortunate to have Lisa Traeger with us today. I see Lisa there. She is Harold Lehman's daughter. And if you have anything to add or any comments, I will unmute you. and perhaps you can share with us.
Hi, Helen. Thank you so much for making this really interesting webinar with Greta available. You know, I'm really glad at the end she touched upon why she called this the humanity of Harold Lehman. I was actually wondering about that all along. And, you know, it almost brought a tear to my eye, honestly, at the end, as she was describing the sensitivity that she observed in my father's artwork and empathy for the working person, and certainly the image that would resonate with inmates at Rikers Island. I think that really touches upon who he was as an artist.
Well, I think that also one of the conflicts is that when workers were portrayed, there was a sense that it was because it was left-wing content, even though this is the time of when collective bargaining was made into law, when a lot of labor laws were passed and labor unions were given recognition. Yet, because of the implication that this was socialistic somehow, that was one of the reasons that many of these murals were painted over or destroyed. That they, I know that I grew up in Queens, and I remember the LaGuardia Airport mural by James Brooks from my childhood. And in the 50s, those two figures who were shown looking up, that was considered Soviet propaganda. That, you know, these were the young workers of tomorrow, and I mean, it was just nonsense. It was ridiculous, but that was something that was in the air during the McCarthy era, and a lot of these things were just trashed. So it was inadvertent in a way that here are artists celebrating the humanity and the collective enterprise of American workers, that this was turned into something subversive. In fact, I recently, I don't mean to dominate this conversation, but I recently wrote a fiction book in which I actually incorporated a real incident in Skokie, Illinois, where a mural, again, it was interracial. It was a Caucasian, an Asian, and an African-American worker standing together. That was considered uplifting when the design was approved. But once the mural was on the wall, there were all these protests that it was communist propaganda, and it was painted over.
Right. You know, Helen, I wonder, again, I want to give other people a chance, but I have to say this. There is evidence, there is discussion about how much of this type of artwork was basically the FBI had a role in reaching out to collectors and wealthy people to try to encourage more abstract expressionism and to kind of diffuse this kind of realism, this kind of, you know, social statements. What is your opinion, or anyone else's here? Have you heard that?
No, I don't think that's true. I don't think the FBI had anything to do with it, but I think that times changed. After the war, you have people like Mark Rothko and Adolf Gottlieb and Mark Barnett Newman saying, you know, we can't paint the figure anymore because life is different now. But I mean, I think that's a whole other debate. But Ellen has a point, and go right ahead.
Yeah, Greta didn't mention this, but Lehman took part in a mural project. Okay, but it was not on the walls; it was portable murals in Los Angeles with Guston and Kadish and Luis Arenal and a bunch of others. That was raided by the Red Squad of the LA police. Okay,
The block of painters. Yep.
Yeah, yes, right. The block up and Captain Hines, who was like this mean head of the LA police, came and with his guys, and these murals were primarily based on the story of the very obvious and very all over the country discussed story of the Scottsboro boys. Okay, and when the police came, when the Red Squad came, they shot bullets through the eyes of the Black figures that were in the murals, and also through the genital areas. And this was a very big hoo-ha. The group to sue. Okay, they went to court saying that that their works had been destroyed, and the judge ruled against them, saying that they probably did it themselves, and they got nothing. They got nothing
for the
for
publicity.
Yeah, right. But the publicity was bad for them. The publicity was not good. Actually, it turns out that there is an article about this in an LA newspaper, which I discussed this in my article about Guston and Kadish in Mexico, and then in my book Mexico and American Modernism, that I was very confused about, because there were all these Japanese, there were Japanese kind of writing, which I couldn't read, obviously. They showed the murals, two of the murals, one of which was Guston's, before and then after, after the police had shot bullets through them. And I had no idea what that was. And there's a man out here named John Cross who does a lot of research. He's not really an art historian or a historian, but he does a lot of research into things. And he found out for me that was Japan night at the John Reed Club, because these so there was actually, even though Asians were not in the murals, there was also, I'm sure, anti-Asian sentiment on the part of the police, which has never actually been discussed. But Lehman's work, I think, I know was actually reproduced. I don't think the work exists. It shows kind of an African-American man on his knees with chains, with his sort of a prayer position. In numerous books about the way in which the Mexicans influenced American art. So until Reuben Kadish died and left all of his stuff to the Archives of American Art, I think Lehman's work was the only work that anybody actually knew what it looked like from that show. And then fabulously, when Reuben Kadish left everything to the Archives of American Art, there were works by it. He had illustrations of virtually every single work that was, not illustrations, but photographs of every single work in the show. So anyway, I think that Lehman's very, that was a very, I'm guessing that was a very important kind of experience in your father's life that led to some of these later works in which he is talking about humanity. Yeah, and I'm delighted to meet you virtually, because
I see Lauren has her hand up.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm the granddaughter of
hi.
Lehman, and I finished my graduate program just 2 weeks ago, and we were talking. We had a whole class about aesthetic philosophy. And so I really appreciated the part of this lecture where we were talking about Harlem murals. I think the Harlem Renaissance was undoubtedly a really big event for muralists, for artists during this time. So we were recently reading Du Bois. And so I think definitely what Du Bois is talking about with, he talks a lot about what propaganda was during this time. And so I think that we look at propaganda with a totally different definition in mind, whereas in that time, it was anything that might have worked for people who were of a different class than where society was working. So of course, that's what socialism or communism or anything that wasn't democracy necessarily. It was, this idea of rejecting industrialization, like industrializing society. But I think it was also this time where artists were realizing that they could be really impactful with the aesthetics that people are seeing day to day, so much so that now we take them for granted. And so I think we've just our idea of propaganda is so it's extremism that we're thinking about perhaps now, whereas then it was just anything was propaganda, even if it was good.
Well, things are highly politicized today too. So, and of course, with social media, we're in a whole different category. But I see Arlene Schultz has her hand up. So if you'd like to go, Arlene.
Yes, I heard that political story about the reason that everyone turned to abstract expressionism. I've heard that story before from an art teacher. And I really think that it's odd that it coincides with the McCarthy era, where that you didn't want to seem political. So if you did abstract art, it wouldn't seem political.
Yeah.
It's very coincidental. And I really want to see those murals. They have a display, right?
Well, we have a reproduction of the Rikers mural, which of course no longer exists, but you can go to Richmond Hill Public Library in the little town where I grew up in Queens, and you can see the story of Richmond Hill by Philip Evergood. And there are many murals in high schools and in libraries, and the one at LaGuardia in the Marine Air Terminal. As
I've seen that, yeah,
that's been restored. And there are also post office murals, which were not done by the WPA, but in fact, we're going to have a talk in our Art in Focus series in September or October about the Lehman post office mural in Renovo, Pennsylvania, and also how that fits into the whole Treasury Department mural program.
I hope I get the link. I don't know how to get the link.
You'll go on our website and go to the calendar, and that will give you the link.
And this is I have to find out what website I don't remember to find this.
Well, just Google Pollock Krasner and you'll.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Pollock Krasner. Right now, I'm right nearby it. I could almost walk there.
Cool.
Well, I have to find out when they're open. There's a display I want to see there.
Well, there you go. It's the Lehman exhibition. That's on October 30th. And if you go to the website, you'll get the hours and all the information.
Okay.
Jane Weissman has her hand up.
I think we need to remember that censorship still continues. Victor Arnautoff, who was a colleague of Anton Refugee, who did the post office murals in San Francisco, did a series of murals called The Life of Washington in the George Washington High School in San Francisco. And there has been controversy there. And with the result that the school board, well, first the images was George Washington standing over an enslaved person. And then there was a Native American lying down, I suppose dead, and Native American people and Black Americans took umbrage. It's part of this whole cancel culture phenomenon taking place now. But there was enough controversy from those people that overpowered the rights of people, or people who felt that this was a historic mural. Education didn't seem to be enough to say what was going on in these panels, so people could look at them with understanding, and they would know what precipitated those images, and might know that the images today perhaps are problematic. But if we look at our history, there's a lot in our history that's problematic.
Really?
Yeah. So the point is that the controversies and the criticisms back in the 1930s have not stopped.
That's
right. Jane, you know what? You're absolutely correct. And the problem was coming from the parents of the students, believe it or not, who wanted to tear it down because it was not progressive enough. for that audience.
Right, and I can't remember the name of an African-American muralist who's working today, did 2 murals in the school, just kind of in a different part of the school. That was a very inclusive mural with education text to kind of say, okay, this is what it was then. Here we are today. And I'm not quite sure where the status is. They haven't destroyed the mural. I think at this point, they're just covering it up. So there's hope that maybe we will see the light and begin to understand that we can see things in a more rational way.
Well, that's what happened to the Jose Clemente Orozco mural at the New School, when there's a portrait of Stalin in it. And when I first saw it, I guess it was in the 1980s, there was a little drape over that section of it. I mean, they didn't actually rip it off the wall, mercifully, but now the drape has gone away, because it and also there was James Michael Newell's mural in, which high school is it? I believe in the Bronx, where it shows African Americans picking cotton. And it's supposed to show the progress of, we got away from that, just like the Harlem Hospital murals. We stopped picking cotton and we became, free. But that was covered up for many years because people didn't want to see, they didn't want to acknowledge that as a historical fact. So a lot of these things, they do change. And well, there's the big controversy about Thomas Hart Benton's Indiana mural that Greta was showing. One section of it shows the Ku Klux Klan. And that was considered, or is now considered, we don't want to see that. But it was part of Indiana history. And he wasn't celebrating it. He was actually showing it in a bad light. But
And actually, he did a series of 10 panels that were in the show at the Whitney. About 6 of them were. I think we're now in Nebraska, and they show some really horrific images. And for a man of his political persuasion, it's kind of amazing that they were so
critical.
So critical, thank you. That they were so critical, and they're very, very strong. And I remember, and most people, and I referred them to a mural colleague of mine to say, do you know these murals? And he didn't know them. And he has studied murals all across the country. So nobody is quite aware of them. And I think we should be.
Yeah. Well, because Benton is considered so reactionary, but he actually, he had a pretty critical eye about American culture. Now I see Bobby had her hand up.
Yeah, I was just saying that I was very struck when Greta Berman was talking with that wonderful quote about how this brought art to such a different audience and how it was the availability of, things that looked like Renaissance or Baroque murals, huge compositions that could be at any post office or school. But then in this almost the same sentence, she talked about people working in the room and not even noticing it right now, and they would go every day. So it's very interesting to me to know that there is a mural that was on the wall for many, many years with George Washington that people never looked at or cared about too much, even if they looked at it. And suddenly it's a cause célèbre. And this kind of going in and out in terms of attention with something that is visible to everybody for a very long time. So it's kind of interesting that in the beginning, this was a whole new concept to be able to see art in public places. And then, why did we get inured to it? And why and when do we suddenly find these things to be so controversial? It's an interesting track, and maybe Ellen knows why.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I am gonna. I just looked it up because I was pretty sure of this. In June, the San Francisco School Board reversed their vote and said that it does not have to be removed, and nor covered up, nor whatever. They decided in 2019 to remove it, and they June 22nd they said it'll remain on display. Voted 4-3 to rescind the the removal.
Mm.
So so I think that's a good sign. I mean,
Great sign.
one of the things, this reminds me of what I consider to be the total nonsense that's going on relative to the Philip Guston exhibition, where you don't trust people to look at things and be able to make their own decisions. You can have a label that explains Guston under no circumstances is glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, and the way, apparently the way in which the exhibition now has been discussed or whatever, the way the labels and so on from people who have been there say that it's really kind of almost I don't know how to put it, not antagonistic towards the viewers, but really kind of undervaluing the viewers' ability to understand that this was a different, that forgetting the Guston, but going back to the mural in San Francisco, this was a different time period, and so explain that in a wall text, give context for it, and supposedly the Guston exhibition was postponed so that they could give context, but my understanding is that the context is actually quite underwhelming, shall we say, in terms of really respecting the viewer's ability to understand what's actually going on. And I think that that certainly in the John Reed Club situation that Lehman was part of, I mean, that clearly, I mean, it's a little bit like the list of books that just got banned in Florida for children to read, which are some of the best books that have ever been written for young people. And it's kind of sad that we're in that situation, in my opinion.
Well, these things are cyclic, and I hope that this will cycle out at some point. But Lisa, you had something to say?
Yeah, I just want to raise a couple points, which are that first, I don't know if everyone knows, but Ben Shahn was first given the Rikers Island mural assignment.
Oh yeah, Greta mentioned that.
And the reason why it was changed to my dad is because Ben Shahn had done a lot of research on penal history, and his idea was to show various states of incarceration and torture over time. And my father and certainly the Treasury Department who chose him agreed that that might not be the best theme to put in front of prisoners, 3 square meals a day.
Yeah.
So that resonates, I think, with Greta's theme of the humanity of my father being sensitive. Plus, I wanted to bring to light the fact of all of the research my dad did for that mural. So his twin brother at the time was a therapist or a psychologist at Elmira Penitentiary. And so when he got this assignment, I have a letter, in fact, it's in the book, that's part of the exhibit, where my father is writing to his twin brother and very excited about this assignment and says, and this is where you fit in. I want you to give me every kind of book about the criminal mind. I want you to help me understand what would resonate to inspire them to change their life. At the time, Rikers was a very progressive facility. The idea was to rehabilitate these prisoners and to give them hope and give them training. And there was a tree farm on Rikers Island, and there were all of these very progressive ideas of what the potential of rehabilitation. I firmly believe that in the 1960s, when that warden decided that mural had to come down, that was the beginning of the end for those men in that penitentiary. And that's when the dehumanization and the hellhole that Rikers Island is today, that was the starting point. I believe that.
Jane?
I think we should remember too that Faith Ringo painted a mural for the Women's House of Detention
Right.
that eventually got whitewashed, and fortunately it was still there. So the overpainting could be removed, and now the painting is in a museum. And it was a very positive mural because it showed all the careers that women could ascribe to if they were given opportunity to do so.
Well, that was true of Man's Daily Bread as well, and the Refugee mural, which has been restored, and I believe is in a waiting room or one of the public areas at Rikers. But I think that part of the lack of value is because these things were not privately commissioned. They were commissioned by the government, and so they were considered make work. That a lot of the art that was made was as if once it was made, the whole point was to give the people a paycheck. And of course, that was very inspiring to the artists. You know, I interviewed many of them, including Harold Lehman, who was very forthcoming when I was doing my thesis research. And the idea that they were actually earning a living wage made them identify with the workers. It gave them a feeling of solidarity with the workers. And they even formed a union, as if anyone would care that artists would go on strike. But they did have a union, and it gave them this sense of camaraderie that we're all in it together and that we're doing something that is valued. We don't have to sell the work. People are paying us to do it. And I think that is one of the more inspiring and certainly unique aspects of the WPA and the related programs that were wage-based programs, not the commissioned program like the Treasury section, because that was a competition. But this, you did not have to compete for the money, you just got your paycheck. So if I think we're kind of running out of time, guys. I'm sorry to cut this off because this is really wonderful that everyone is so inspired by this. But I do have to ask you to come back next week to join us for the final lecture in this season series on August 28th at 5 p.m. when Bill Agee, one of the foremost experts on American modernism, will talk on post-1940 American Cubism. And I'm sure he'll show a picture of Swing Landscape when he does his talk in person at Hoey Hall in East Hampton, but also on Zoom for those of you who cannot join us live. Just check our website calendar for details. And thank you all for being with us today, and especially the Traeger family, and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Helen. Bye-bye.
Bye.